Hey everyone, welcome to another installment of Harry Potter Theory. The Headmasters of Hogwarts were some of the most interesting wizards and witches in the world. Some were expert potioneers, some were lightning-fast duelists, and some, even, were experts on dark magic. Who were they, and what did they contribute to the Hogwarts legacy? We'll answer these questions and more in today's video. Number 1. First Headmaster of Hogwarts. Although Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry was founded in 990 AD, it didn't start with a headmaster. At that time, the four co-founders, Godric Gryffindor, Rowena Ravenclaw, Helga Hufflepuff, and Salazar Slytherin, oversaw the school's administration. But by the following century, that changed. Salazar Slytherin departed, leaving the management of his house in disarray. It was likely during the aftermath of Slytherin's untimely self-exile that the other, aging co-founders hired someone to help run the school. This was the first headmaster of Hogwarts, but unfortunately we don't know much about him. All that remains is a golden brass statue that was moulded in his honour. 2. Brian Gagwilde. The next headmaster to show up in historical records was a professor by the name of Brian Gagwilde. In his portrait, which hangs inside Hogwarts Headmaster's office, shows that Gagwilde was a particularly unique-looking wizard. He wore a bright orange coned cap, a bright green tunic, and a maroon scarf. He was likely born in England, although Scotland and Ireland also produced many of the professors who would later work at Hogwarts. Gagwilde's lasting contribution to the wizarding world was a book published by Luca Books called Jiggery Pokery and Hocus Pocus, a textbook that focused on mischievous spells. 3. Heliotrope Wilkins. Presumably, the next headmaster of Hogwarts was a witch named Heliotrope Wilkins. Her impact on the wizarding world was even less than Brian Gagwilde's. As a headmistress, Heliotrope continued Hogwarts' strong tradition of treating witches and wizards equally, which contrasted quite a bit with the Muggle world of the time. 4. Phyllida Spore. Phyllida Spore was a noblewoman and headmistress of Hogwarts sometime in the 1400s. She wore a striking gold brooch with a dark purple stone gem nestled inside. With her long black hair and iconic dark mole, she bore a striking resemblance to a later Hogwarts headmaster, Severus Snape. Spore was quite an active academic and produced a textbook for herbology class titled 1000 Magical Herbs and Fungi. 5. Edessa Sakndenberg. The next headmaster appears in the 1500s. Edessa Sakndenberg, a headmistress of British heritage, served Hogwarts for a few decades during that century. According to some reports, Edessa contributed a great deal to textbooks on Muggle history, and if you take one look at her portrait, you can see that she was quite an imposing witch, and possibly a skilled potions master. 6. Fytherley Undercliffe. Fytherley Undercliffe was another headmaster of the 16th century. With a massive white beard, a tall wizard's hat, and a dark brown staff, Fytherley looks every bit the part of a medieval wizard. During his time as headmaster, he often sported ornate rings on his hands, and a golden chain that held a series of rings on its end. We can't be sure if these were powerful magical relics or simple heirlooms, but it's entirely possible that they possessed some intrinsic magical properties. Fytherley also had a strange connection with Christian angels. On his portrait at Hogwarts, the order of all 8 angels were written above his image. 7. Antonia Creaseworthy. Antonia Creaseworthy was a witch born in 1609 who lived for nearly 200 years. At some point in her lengthy life, Antonia became a professor and then headmistress at Hogwarts. Antonia, like Edessa before her, was also a noblewoman. She has no textbooks credited to her name, but she often was a great source of ancient news and gossip. When students sought old Daily Prophet stories, Antonia's portrait was able to recite the news, as if it were only yesterday. 8. Elizabeth Burke. Elizabeth Burke is the next headmistress that appears in historical records. Even though her time as an administrator at Hogwarts wasn't particularly memorable, Burke's left quite a mark on Harry Potter's peers. Her portrait, which rotated around the school each year, often shouted about the superiority of purebloods and the excellence of Slytherin students. 9. Giffard Abbott. Giffard Abbott was a British wizard, former Hogwarts student, and former headmaster of the school sometime after Burke and Creaseworthy's tenure. In his portrait, he's shown alongside a high-shouldered hound, which was strangely unique for headmasters. They were rarely depicted with pets, so Abbott must have been a dog enthusiast during his life. When he was initially sorted by the Sorting Hat, he was placed into Hufflepuff, making him one of the rare headmasters to graduate from that house. 10. Vulpus. Vulpus is the next headmaster listed in the historical records, but just like so many others, not much is known about the deceased wizard, and when we turn to his portrait, we're left with even more questions than when we started, as Vulpus's vampiric appearance makes us wonder if he was afflicted with any magical maladies. 11. Vindictus Viridian. Thankfully, the next headmaster on our list, Vindictus Viridian, achieved a great deal during his life, so we'll have a lot to talk about. According to historians' best guesses, Viridian was born sometime in the 17th century and might have joined Hogwarts staff during the 1800s. As a teacher, he became quite skilled at potion making and used that talent to instruct children at Hogwarts. He was also quite the writer. During his time in academia, he created an odd little book, one that would have been more at home in Herpo the Fowl's home rather than the headmaster's office. The book was titled Curses and Counter-Curses. Bewitch your friends and befuddle your enemies with the latest revenges. Hair loss, jelly legs, tongue-tying, and much, much more. The text must have made him popular among students, who never seemed to relent in teasing their peers. 12. Amrose Swott. Sometime later, Amrose Swott was listed as another headmaster at Hogwarts. Unfortunately, Swott must have lived an uninteresting life, because he barely fills a page in the histories. But there is one interesting tidbit to take from Swott. On his portrait, the phrase ora et labora is inscribed. That line, taken from the Benedictine monks of the Middle Ages, meant that simply sitting around and praying or studying could never replace good, honest work. With such a practical mindset, it wouldn't surprise me if Amrose Swott was a popular headmaster amongst the students of the era. 13. Dylis Derwent. Dylis Derwent was a powerful magical healer and an employee of St. Mungo's Hospital for magical maladies and injuries. Eventually, she went on to become a headmistress at Hogwarts. Although her career path wasn't the most conventional one, Derwent was quite a success. Her students and the other faculty members at the school were enamored with Derwent, so much so that even during Harry Potter's time at Hogwarts, Derwent was fondly remembered as one of the greatest teachers the school had ever had. And since Hogwarts didn't really provide the most accurate dates, Dylis Derwent might have actually predated some of the other wizards on this list. According to some, she died in the mid to late 18th century. 14. Everard. Headmaster Everard, just like Dylis, was another much beloved headmaster from Hogwarts history. Just like the other members of this list, we're not really certain when he lived, but if you take a look at his portrait, the clothes that he wears give us a few hints. Based on his style of hat and coat, he probably served as a headmaster sometime in the late 1700s to mid-1800s. 15. Eupraxia Mole. Eupraxia Mole became the headmistress of Hogwarts sometime in the late 1800s. As a headmistress during the Muggles' second era of industrialization, Eupraxia stood as a symbolic break against the storm of technology. Although much of the wizarding world remained oblivious, it would only be a matter of time before the devices the Muggles created during this era would come to affect the world at large. 16. Quentin Trimble. Quentin Trimble was the headmaster of Hogwarts sometime after Eupraxia Mole. As a member of Hogwarts faculty, Quentin was renowned for his knowledge of dark magic, and he even penned the text, The Dark Forces, a guide to self-protection. That book became the basis for all future Defense Against the Dark Arts classes. 17. Limebert. Another headmaster of the era was simply known as Professor Limebert. Unfortunately, he doesn't have any textbooks credited to his name, so we don't know much about him. Based on his portrait, he might have actually been fairly young when he took on the role of headmaster, but that is the only interesting tidbit that we could guess at. 18. Dexter Fortescue. Dexter Fortescue was a headmaster during the same era, and just like Limebert, his time at Hogwarts is a great mystery. But, luckily for us, one of Dexter's descendants lived during Harry's time at school. His name was Florian Fortescue, and he owned a famous ice cream shop alongside the other magical stores in Diagon Alley. As a store owner, Florian was a kind-hearted soul, and even tended to Harry at times, before Lord Voldemort had the shop owner killed. 19. Basil Fronsac. Basil Fronsac was a headmaster at Hogwarts during the 19th century, and interestingly, bears a striking resemblance to Professor Dumbledore. With half-moon spectacles, a long grey beard, and a tall black hat, Basil looks like a quintessential old, kind wizard. Basil studied in Ravenclaw when he was a student at Hogwarts, and as a headmaster, favoured that house whenever an issue arose. 20. Walter Aragon. Walter Aragon was headmaster of Hogwarts during the late 19th, early 20th century, but while becoming headmaster of Hogwarts is an achievement of epic proportions, that certainly wasn't all that Aragon, a very driven wizard, was able to achieve in his lifetime. In fact, Aragon, a clear academic, was also a published author and chess champion. His interest in the care of magical creatures led him to authoring a book entitled Newts of Bognor, and his love for chess meant that he would eventually have a chess competition named after him. Walter died before 1943, but after his death, his portrait was hung at the grand staircase as well as inside the headmaster's office. 21. Mordicus Egg. There is a portrait of a man named Mordicus Egg in the headmaster's office, but we don't know if it's the same Mordicus Egg we have information on from canon. It's entirely possible that Headmaster Mordicus Egg was an entirely different Mordicus Egg than the one I'm about to discuss. Mordicus Egg, as we know him, was a wizard and Hogwarts resident Muggle expert, going on to author The Philosophy of the Mundane, Why the Muggles Prefer Not to Know, and Cooking the Muggle Way. Provided that this Mordicus was at Hogwarts as late as 1993, it's unlikely that he's the same Mordicus who once acted as headmaster, but that's still unclear. Unless Egg was exceptionally old, I don't see how he could have served as headmaster in a time period that isn't already spoken for by other headmasters. 22. Brutus Scrimgeour. Brutus Scrimgeour, who is more than likely a distant relative of Rufus Scrimgeour, served as headmaster of Hogwarts during the 19th or 20th century. Dates are unclear. Scrimgeour was known to have been a huge Quidditch fan, with Quidditch even becoming a part of his legacy, going on to write the Beater's Bible. It's likely that Scrimgeour was a beater himself at one point, at least I'd hope so. Scrimgeour was immortalized in the form of several portraits hung throughout Hogwarts Castle. One portrait, which was hung in the Hogwarts Trophy Room, hid a secret passage to the 4th floor, opened by the password Beati Pacifici. Another of his portraits was hung in the headmaster's office. 23. Phineas Nigellus Black. Phineas Nigellus Black, of the infamous House of Black, was born in 1847, and became one of the most influential members of the family to ever live. As most Blacks would, Phineas attended Hogwarts, and was, of course, placed into House Slytherin. Phineas was also very vocal in carrying on another family tradition, his hatred for Muggles and mudbloods. After he graduated from Hogwarts, around the year 1865, Phineas married Ursula Flint. Together, they had 5 children. When he wasn't conceiving children, Phineas became a professional teacher, passing on all that he had learned to the next generation of wizards and witches. His talent eventually brought him to Hogwarts, but it's hard to know how effective he was as a teacher. When it comes to Black's teaching style, the record books simply point out that he hated his job, and he hated the children. That didn't stop him from achieving success, though, as he eventually rose to the position of headmaster. Phineas Nigellus Black went down in history as the least like headmaster that Hogwarts ever had, at least according to his great-great-grandson Sirius. 24. Armando Dippet. Armando Dippet, Dumbledore's predecessor as headmaster, was born in the year 1637 and lived to the staggering age of 355, making him one of the oldest wizards in wizarding history. According to Dumbledore, when Dippet left the position between 1965 and 1971, he was nearly bald and somewhat feeble. For 355, I'd certainly hope so. Dippet served as headmaster for a few decades, starting somewhere between 1940 and remaining in the position until, possibly, the early 70s. Dippet can be easily remembered as the serving headmaster during Tom Riddle's time at the school, the same time that the Chamber of Secrets was being opened and students were being attacked. Dippet was also infamously responsible for the expulsion of Rubeus Hagrid. After his death, Dippet, much like other headmasters, was immortalized in a portrait hung inside the headmaster's office. 25. Albus Dumbledore. The man that needs no introduction. Dumbledore was, in my opinion, the greatest headmaster to ever hold the title. He served with distinction from 1971 to 1997, with a few little hiccups and suspensions along the way. But during those years he made a considerable impact on some of the most important students and staff that would ever exist in the wizarding world. Elphias Doge put it best. Albus Dumbledore was never proud or vain. He could find something to value in anyone, however apparently insignificant or wretched, and I believe that his early losses endowed him with great humanity and sympathy. 26. Dolores Umbridge. In 1995, disaster struck Hogwarts. For you see, it was this year that Umbridge was appointed as the new Defense Against the Dark Arts professor. Umbridge was a poor teacher, mainly because she taught her own biased and ineffective curriculum. However, she didn't act in this role alone for long, as she was eventually appointed as Hogwarts' first ever High Inquisitor, a position that she used to harass students and peers. However, this power still wasn't enough for Umbridge, as Dumbledore was still technically in charge. He was headmaster. During this time the Ministry, namely Fudge, and Dumbledore were continually butting heads. Fudge was lashing out, he was blinded by fear, and in utter denial that the Dark Lord Voldemort had returned. Dumbledore continually tried to convince Fudge of the truth, but his efforts were futile, and Fudge continued to punish Dumbledore in whatever way he could. Eventually, Dolores Umbridge and her inquisitorial squad discovered the headquarters of Dumbledore's army in the Room of Requirement. Dumbledore's army was of course formed by Harry and had nothing to do with Dumbledore, but with Dumbledore's name in the group's name, fingers started to get pointed at him. Dumbledore happily took responsibility for the formation of the group, claiming that it was all his idea and that no student should be punished in his place. After a minor scuffle with Umbridge, some Aurors, and Fudge, Dumbledore eventually left Hogwarts. This left the school without a headmaster. At this point, Umbridge passed Educational Decree No. 28, which effectively replaced Dumbledore with Umbridge. Umbridge was headmistress of Hogwarts. However, when irrefutable evidence came to light pointing to Voldemort's return, Dumbledore was reappointed as headmaster and, much to the joy of the Hogwarts population, Umbridge no longer had anything to do with the school. 27. Severus Snape. Severus Snape served as headmaster during the 97-98 school year. It was a dark time. Dumbledore had just died, Voldemort and his Death Eaters had taken over Hogwarts, and the Ministry. Muggleborns weren't allowed to attend Hogwarts, and students were being punished with unforgivable curses. What a time. Snape's role as headmaster ended when Harry, Hermione, and Ron, who had returned to the school, rallied the students and staff against Snape and his new cohort. A duel then erupted between Snape and McGonagall, with Snape eventually jumping out of a classroom window. Snape was still acting as a double agent at this time, and I don't expect that he would have wanted to hurt anyone, so fleeing was probably the best option. 28. Minerva McGonagall. Minerva McGonagall served as the Transfiguration Professor of Hogwarts for many years, also acting as stand-in headmaster during Dumbledore's suspensions. After Dumbledore's death, McGonagall served headmaster Severus Snape, who had been appointed by Voldemort and the Death Eaters. However, after Snape had been effectively ousted from the school, McGonagall took over the position. After the war had ended, McGonagall was offered the Order of Merlin First Class by the new Minister for Magic, Kingsley Shacklebolt, and just 4 short months after that, McGonagall, who was more suitable for the role than anyone, was properly appointed as the new Hogwarts Headmistress. McGonagall presided over Hogwarts students beginning with the 1998 to 1999 school year, and after her promotion, moved into Dumbledore's old quarters. As she had given up her Transfiguration posting, she was now responsible for, among other things, finding her replacement. You might also remember that McGonagall served as a special messenger for Hogwarts, and would travel to the homes of prospective Muggle-born students and inform their families of their child's magical abilities. This task was eventually handed off to Rubeus Hagrid, which is questionable given his immense size and initial shock value. And that's it for this video. Did you know about all of these headmasters? Which were new names for you? Leave a comment down below. Until next time, remember, it does not do to dwell on dreams and forget to live.